The belt came down hard, slicing the air with a crack, before it struck her shoulder. Annie Caldera didn't scream. Screaming never helped. It only made May angrier, drunker, meaner. The pain bit deep into her back, but Annie bit harder into the inside of her cheek. "You bring home less than $2, Annie May slurred, her face red with rage and whiskey, and I'll use something worse than the belt." Annie stayed on her knees, head bowed. Her hands trembled on the cold wood floor, still wet from the scrub water she'd spilled. The rag lay in the overturned bucket, soap slick and useless now. Her knuckles were raw. Her dress was soaked through. Outside, wind howled against the boards like a hungry animal. May paced behind her like she was sizing up cattle for slaughter. "I ain't feeding a useless girl through another winter. Pritchard's got work hauling freight. You're going." "Yes, Mama. And don't you come back with empty hands. You bring back $2 or a bottle of rye." Annie stood slowly, her limbs stiff and cold. She reached for the wall peg, pulling down the threadbare shawl her father gave her the Christmas before the mine collapsed. The moment her fingers touched it, May grabbed her arm and yanked her close. "You come back with $1, Annie." Her voice dropped low, thick with venom. "And I'll make you wish you died in the mine with him." Annie didn't speak. She couldn't. Her tongue felt thick and dry. She just nodded, turned, and stepped into the wind. Snow hit her like a slap. It was still mid-morning, but the sky was steel gray and already falling heavy with the kind of flakes that stuck to everything and didn't melt. The trail from the shack to town was just under 2 miles. On good days, she could make it in 40 minutes. On days like this, with boots that barely held together and wind that clawed through her dress like nails, it would take longer. The Idaho Territory was beautiful in the summer. In the winter, it was a curse, each step down the trail soaked through her boots. The hem of her dress froze stiff against her legs. The shawl did little more than collect snow on her shoulders. By the time the outline of Silver Bend's main road came into view, she couldn't feel her fingers. She pushed open the door to Pritchard's general store with a shaky hand. The little bell above the door jingled a sound that used to make her heart flutter when she was small. Now it just mocked her. Warmth from the stove washed over her. For a second, she let herself believe she could just stay here, that she could curl up by the fire, sip something hot, and sleep. Mr. Pritchard looked up from behind the counter. His eyes shifted quickly to the dark bruise along her jaw, then back down. "Mama said you needed someone to help haul freight." He hesitated. "Business has been slow. Snow's keeping folks home. I don't have any work today." Annie's throat closed. "Please," she whispered. "I can sweep. I can." He reached under the counter and slid a silver dollar toward her. "It's all I can spare. $1. Not enough for bread and not nearly enough for peace." Her hand trembled as she took it. The door opened behind her. She stepped aside quickly, avoiding the man's path. Her eyes barely met his chest before she backed up, heart pounding. He was huge. He ducked slightly to pass through the doorway, heavy with snow and fur. His coat looked like it was made from animals he'd killed himself. His boots were caked in snow. But it was his eyes that made her stomach twist cold gray like the frozen pond that swallowed her cousin last year. He didn't look at her, just dropped a heavy burlap sack on the counter in front of Pritchard. "Blacktail," Pritchard said, voice jumping slightly. "Wasn't expectin' you till spring." The man Blacktail didn't respond. He opened the sack. Furs. Silver fox, beaver, marten. A fortune in winter. "Store credit?" Pritchard asked. "Cash," the man said simply. Pritchard blinked. "That'll drain my safe." Blacktail gave him a look that said he didn't care. Annie stepped back again, trying to slip past the trapper and out the door. Her foot caught on the loose board by the stove. She stumbled, crashing lightly against his arm. He didn't move. "I'm sorry," she gasped, backing away. "I didn't mean." She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the hand. It never came. Instead, a voice, low and rough as gravel, spoke. "Who did that to your face?" Annie opened her eyes slowly. I fell," she lied. "Don't lie to me, it's nothing." Pritchard cleared his throat. "That's Annie Caldera. Lives up past the split ridge. May's girl. I know where the Caldera shack is," Blacktail said, still watching her. "You headed home now?" She nodded, humiliated. With that, he gestured to the silver dollar. Annie didn't answer. He turned to Pritchard. "How much for the furs?" Pritchard hesitated. 230, maybe more. "In gold." "Sure, just give me a moment." Pritchard scurried to the back room. Blacktail turned to Annie again. "Your mother drinks." "Yes, sir." "She hits you." "I manage." "No, you don't." Pritchard returned with a leather pouch. Blacktail took it and faced Annie. "Show me your house." "What, take me to your mother?" Annie took a step back. "Why?" He slung the pouch over his shoulder. "Because I'm going to buy you from her." The air left her lungs. "I don't understand." "You don't need to. Just show me the way." Outside, the snow fell faster. The trail home was buried now. May's belt was waiting, or worse. But beside her stood a man with winter in his eyes and coin in his hand. A stranger who didn't flinch when she cowered. A man who said without blinking that he would pay to take her away. She didn't trust him, but she didn't trust anything anymore. She turned toward the trail. He followed, and behind them, the bell over Pritchard's door jingled once more. The shack looked even smaller in the snow. Wind had blown drifts halfway up the walls, and the sagging roof groaned under the weight of ice and neglect. The windows were covered with rags nailed tight to keep out the wind. Smoke curled from the chimney in slow, angry spirals. Annie stopped at the edge of the clearing. Her feet burned from the thawing pain of cold, but she didn't move. Behind her, Tobias Blacktail stood silent. His breath misted in the frigid air. She could hear the low creak of leather as he shifted his weight, but he said nothing. "She's mean when she drinks," Annie whispered. "I've handled worse." She stepped forward. The front door wasn't latched. It never was. She pushed it open, and the heat from the fire inside slammed into her face, clashing hard against the cold she wore like a second skin. The familiar smell of sour whiskey and wood smoke rushed her lungs. Her mother was in the rocker by the hearth. The fire poker stretched across her knees like a scepter. "You're back early," May muttered, eyes locked on the flames. Then she saw the man behind her. The poker lifted. "Where's my money, girl?" Annie swallowed hard. Tobias stepped into the doorway, blocking the wind. He ducked slightly under the lintel and removed his hat, snow trailing off the brim in thick clumps. May's eyes narrowed. "Who the hell are you?" "Name's Tobias Blacktail. I live up on the ridge near Bitter Hollow." "The trapper." Her voice twisted into a laugh. "Heard of you. Heard you're half wild, half Nez Perce, and all crazy. They say a lot of things." May looked him up and down, the poker still raised. "You with her? I came to make you an offer." May's eyebrows shot up. "An offer for what? We ain't got nothing worth stealing. I'm not here to steal." Tobias reached into his coat and pulled the leather pouch from his saddlebag. He set it down on the rickety table beside the rocker. Gold spilled across the surface with a sound that stopped the room. Hard, heavy, undeniable. May stared. Her hand trembled slightly on the poker. "What kind of offer? 500 in gold," Tobias said flatly. "It's yours." May blinked. "For what?" He turned his eyes toward Annie. Her. The word dropped like a stone. Annie's knees went weak. She gripped the edge of the doorway, eyes darting between them. May's jaw twitched. She looked at her daughter for a long moment. A flicker of something passed across her face, surprise maybe, or memory. Then it vanished. You want to buy my daughter? That's right. May barked a laugh. She ain't worth $5, let alone 500. Can't cook, can't clean without breaking something. Slow as tar and just as useful. I'm not asking for a refund. May picked up the pouch, letting the gold run through her fingers like water. Her eyes gleamed with hunger. Take her, she said. Annie made a sound, small, broken. Mama May didn't look at her. She was already counting under her breath, lips moving fast, wild with calculation. Mama, please, don't do this. May finally turned to her, eyes blazing. Don't you mama me! You've been nothing but a burden since the day you came into this world. Your daddy worked himself into the grave feeding your mouth. Annie flinched. That's not true. You think I wanted you? You think I chose to raise a whimpering, half-wit brat when I could have left, I should have left. Should have drowned you in the wash basin when I had the chance. Tobias took a step forward, but Annie held up her hand. She was shaking, but she wasn't backing away. Not this time. May turned back to the gold. 500. I could get out of this rotten place. Start over somewhere warm. Maybe down in Salt Lake or farther west. Find me a man who ain't been hollowed out by kids and copper mines. Annie's voice barely rose above a whisper. I'm your daughter. No, May said without hesitation. You were a mistake I lived too long with. Now I don't have to anymore. She turned to Tobias. Take her and go. I never want to see her face again. The room was silent, but for the crackle of the fire. Tobias looked at Annie. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes waited like a held breath. Get your things, he said quietly. Whatever you can carry. I don't have anything, Annie said. Her voice sounded far away to her own ears. I own nothing. Tobias turned toward the door. Then let's go. Annie didn't look back. She didn't want to see her mother cradling the gold, didn't want to hear the creak of the rocker as May returned to her fire and her drink. She stepped out into the snow, her feet numb, her chest hollow. Tobias walked beside her without speaking. The wind had picked up again. Snow swirled around their boots, erasing their tracks almost as fast as they made them. The trail curved past a fallen pine. She kept her eyes ahead, breath-short arms pulled tight to her chest. She didn't cry. Not because it didn't hurt. Because crying never made it stop. You have somewhere to sleep tonight? She asked suddenly. Tobias looked down at her. My cabin's about 12 miles from here. We'll take the wagon most of the way, but the last few miles are too steep for wheels. We walk. I can walk. I know. She hesitated, her breath catching in her throat. Why did you do it? He didn't answer for a long time. Snow fell heavier, coating the shoulders of his coat, the brim of his hat. 6 years ago, he said, finally, I had a wife named Sakaya. We had a daughter named Mira. Fever took them both. Annie glanced up at him. I couldn't save them, Tobias said. I lived with that. His eyes met hers, piercing and strange and solid. Then I saw you in that store, and I couldn't watch it happen again. Annie looked away. The trees loomed taller now, darker, the mountains rising beyond them like quiet sentinels. She didn't trust him, but she followed. The storm hadn't let up, and the road was vanishing under their feet. The wagon waited just beyond the ridge. She walked with her head down, hands numb and empty, trying to forget the sound of gold clinking in her mother's hands. But she couldn't forget the way Tobias had stood in her doorway saying nothing and then said everything. "Take her," her mother had said. "She ain't worth a damn." Annie pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders. If that had been true, why had someone paid to prove otherwise? The wind thinned as they crested the last ridge. Tobias slowed the mule cart to a halt and looked over his shoulder. Annie hadn't spoken in miles, but she hadn't asked to stop either. She just sat quiet beside him, hands tucked under her coat lips, pale and pressed tight. Down below, nestled between the pines and pressed into the rock like it had grown there, sat the cabin. It wasn't much a one-room log structure, smoke rising from a thin chimney, and a paddock made from rough-cut rail fencing. A few goats huddled in one corner under a crude lean-to, and a coop sagged under snow near the edge of the brush. There were signs of life, but no sign of anyone else. "That it?" Annie asked, voice hoarse from the cold. "That's it," Tobias said. "It's quiet. That's the point." They made their way down the narrow slope, hooves crunching against packed snow wheels, creaking with every turn. At the bottom, Tobias jumped down and held out a hand. Annie hesitated, then accepted it. Her legs nearly gave from the stiffness, but he didn't comment. The inside of the cabin was warmer than she expected. The fire had already been started. Clearly, Tobias had a routine. A cast-iron stove stood in one corner with a blackened pot hanging from its hook, giving off the smell of beans and herbs. A single table with 2 chairs, a workbench with tools, a small shelf of books, and 2 narrow cots along either wall. Everything was plain, worn, and meticulously clean. "This is yours," she asked, stepping inside, eyes scanning the small space. "It's enough." She nodded. Her eyes landed on the second cot. It was made up neatly, blankets, folded pillow fluffed. It looked like no one had used it in a long time. Tobias caught her gaze. That was Mira's. Annie froze. "You don't have to sleep there. I'll clear a space by the hearth and take the floor." "I don't mind." He shook his head. "You don't touch that bed until you feel ready. That's between you and her." She didn't ask more. There was something in his tone that closed the door gently but firmly. Tobias handed her a woolen blanket. "There's water in the barrel by the door. Use it to wash your hands, not for drinking. We melt snow for that." She took the blanket, held it to her chest, like armor. "You really live out here all alone? I used to have neighbors," he said, hanging his coat on a hook by the door. "A mile east, the Talbots. They left 2 winters ago. Folks don't stay long in these parts unless they've got a reason. And I buried mine up on the ridge." Annie turned away, pretending to study the pot on the stove. The silence in the room was soft, not empty. It didn't press on her like back home. It just breathed. Tobias ladled beans into a dented tin bowl and set it on the table with a thick hunk of cornbread. "Eat. It's not fancy, but it'll warm you." She sat slowly, hands hovering over the food, like she wasn't sure it was really hers. He poured a cup of water from a metal pitcher and slid it across. Annie took one bite, then another. Her hands trembled. She hadn't realized how starved she was until now. The beans were smoky, the bread crusty and soft inside. She wiped at her eyes with the back of her wrist and kept eating. When the bowl was clean, Tobias took it without a word and placed it in the basin near the stove. He looked over at her. "There's chores if you want them." She blinked. "Chores, wood needs splitting. Goats need feeding. You'll need something to do with your hands or the quiet will get too loud." She nodded slowly. "I can try. You don't need to prove anything here." "I know, but I want to." He gave a small nod and moved to the back wall. From a peg, he took down an extra coat, patched but warm, and handed it to her. then a pair of mittens, mismatched but thick. She bundled up, and together they stepped outside. The cold was sharp, but it didn't cut like before. Maybe it was the food. Maybe it was the blanket of peace around this place. Tobias showed her how to spread feed, where to crack the ice for the goat's water. She watched carefully, hands steady for once. When he handed her the axe, she paused. "I've never done this. You'll learn." He placed a log on the stump and stepped back. "Swing steady. Not hard. Let the weight of the axe do the work." She raised it above her head, heart pounding, then brought it down. It struck off-center and bounced. Tobias didn't flinch. "Again," he said. She tried 3 more times before it split. Her shoulders were burning, but when it cracked, the sound filled her with something strange. Not pride exactly, just rightness. Like maybe her body hadn't been useless after all. She set another log. Tobias moved beside her and took the axe. He showed her how to keep her wrists straight, how to breathe through the motion. She watched the muscles in his arms work beneath the sleeves. He moved like the wind moved trees, strong, steady, necessary. They worked until the sun disappeared behind the trees and the air turned bitter again. Inside, Tobias lit the oil lamp, trimmed the wick with careful fingers. Annie pulled off her mittens and blew on her hands. "You said I don't owe you anything," she said quietly. He looked over from the lamp. "That's right. Then why did you come back for me?" He paused. Then he said, "Because no one ever came back for me." She let that settle between them. A part of her wanted to ask more, but the rest of her already knew it wasn't time. She lay down on the floor by the hearth that night, wrapped in the thick wool blanket. Tobias sat nearby, carving something from a piece of pine. The knife made soft, scraping sounds, rhythmic as breath. "Is it always this quiet?" she asked. "No," he said. "Sometimes the coyotes howl." She waited, listening. But not tonight. The flames danced low, casting long shadows on the log walls. Annie curled tighter into the blanket, muscles sore, belly warm. The last thing she saw before her eyes closed was Tobias sitting there, still carving, still silent, still watching the fire like it held secrets. She dreamed of nothing, and for the first time in years, that was enough. Because no one ever came back for me. Snow fell again that night, soft and silent, like the sky was laying a blanket over everything broken. Morning brought a pale gray stillness, the kind that blurred the line between the living and the lost. Annie woke before the fire did, wrapped in the wool blanket, her body aching from muscles she hadn't used in years. Her hands throbbed from the axe handle, but she didn't mind. For once, the ache had meaning. Tobias had already gone out. She could hear the low murmur of the goats and the creak of the barn door in the wind. She stood, slowly added wood to the stove and lit a match the way he'd shown her. Her fingers trembled a little, but the flame caught. The fire cracked to life, and something inside her stirred with it. She found a kettle and boiled water for tea. It was weak stuff, steeped from dried leaves and a pinch of mint, but it was hot. She sat at the table, holding the tin cup in both hands. Through the frost-rimmed window, she watched him move with purpose, feeding, mending, checking the fencing. He was a man stitched together by routine. Nothing fancy, just necessary. By the time he stepped in, brushing snow from his shoulders, the stove had warmed the cabin, and the scent of oats filled the room. "You made breakfast," he said, surprised. "I tried." She glanced at the pot. "It might be more like boiled paste." "Boiled paste is better than nothing," he said, removing his gloves. "Smells right." They ate in silence, the kind that didn't press down, but left space to breathe. When they finished, Annie stood and began cleaning the dishes, though her arms ached and her back begged for rest. Tobias leaned against the table. "You don't have to work so hard." "I know," she said. "But if I don't keep moving, I'll think too much." He understood that too well. Some thoughts were like wolves best kept outside. By midday, the snow had lightened into flurries, and the sky opened a bit. Tobias handed her a thick scarf and a pair of wool socks. "There's something I want to show you," he said. They walked past the goat paddock, past the woodpile, and up the slope toward the trees. The path was narrow but well-worn. Boots crunched over hard frost and needles. The air smelled of pine and ash, and somewhere in the distance a woodpecker tapped against hollow bark. At the top of the ridge, a single wooden cross stood weathered and leaning slightly. Snow clung to the edges, and a small pile of rocks circled the base like a guard. Annie stopped, breath caught. "This is her." He nodded. "Mira." She didn't ask how she'd died. She didn't need to. The way he looked at the cross, the way his shoulders folded just slightly forward, told her everything. "I still talk to her sometimes," he said softly. "Helps me remember who I was when she knew me." Annie's throat tightened. She stepped closer and laid a hand on the topmost rock. It was smooth, like it had been held often. "I never knew my mama," she said. "But I always talked to her in my head. Like if I said the right thing, she'd hear me and come back." The wind picked up slightly, carrying pine needles across the ground like whispers. Tobias glanced at her. "Did she ever answer?" "No," she said. "But I talked anyway." They stood together a while longer, two shadows on a ridge, neither needing to fill the silence. When they returned to the cabin, she didn't ask for rest. She took to mending a torn feed sack, while Tobias fixed a broken hinge on the barn door. The hours moved slow and steady. When her stitches slipped, he showed her a trick to keep the thread tight. When his hand cramped, she brought warm water and rubbed it loose. That night, after stew and silence, she surprised him. "You ever think about leaving here?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. He leaned back in the chair, staring at the flame in the stove like it held his reflection. "I did once," he said finally, "right after she passed. I thought about walking till my feet bled. Thought maybe if I hurt bad enough, the rest wouldn't matter." And he looked at her, then eyes like flint and smoke. "And I realized I wasn't meant to outrun the pain. I was meant to build something new inside it." Annie stared down at her hands. "I don't even know what that means." "It means," he said gently, "that scars don't mean the end. They just mean you lived through the worst part." She nodded slowly, pressing her lips tight. That night, she didn't sleep by the fire. Instead, she knelt beside Mira's cot and laid a hand on the folded blanket. "I'm not trying to replace you," she whispered. "I just need somewhere to rest." Then she laid down the mattress, softer than she expected, the pillow holding the scent of lavender and thyme. She closed her eyes, and her breath slowed, not out of exhaustion, but peace. In the darkness, Tobias carved again. His knife moved quiet against the wood, shaving thin curls that caught the lamplight. The figure he shaped was small, delicate shoulders, head bowed, arms open. He didn't name it, but he knew what it meant. Scars don't mean the end. They just mean you lived through the worst part. The storm came without warning, driving in from the east like a beast with claws. Snow hammered the valley thick and fast, erasing the sky. By midday, the wind howled so fierce the barn doors rattled like bones in a box. Tobias had braced everything he could, but Annie stood by the window with her hands knotted in worry, watching the trees sway like drunk men about to fall. She'd never seen a blizzard up close before. The orphanage had been in the valley, sure, but tucked low, protected by hills and concrete. This This was the kind of storm that could swallow a whole life and forget to spit it back out. "Will the goats be all right?" she asked as Tobias pushed more wood into the stove. "They'll huddle together. Animals know how to outlast things." Annie nodded, but her heart thumped like fists on a locked door. She watched him pull on his coat and hat. "You're not going out there now. I have to check the smoke vents," he said. "If they get packed with snow, we'll choke in our sleep." She stepped forward. "Then I'm going too." He paused, one glove half on. "It's not safe, Annie. I don't care. If you're risking it, I'm not sitting here doing nothing." He stared at her, not with the hard kind of stare that ends arguments, but with something softer, something that seemed to weigh her soul before nodding slowly. "Fine. But stay close. One wrong step, and this storm'll take you." They moved out into the white roar. The snow slapped her cheeks and filled her mouth like dust. Tobias led his steps deep and slow. Annie held the back of his coat, gripping tight. They made it to the back shed, where the smoke vents pushed steam into the sky. He cleared them with a shovel hands, moving fast. Annie used her scarf to wipe the smaller pipe's fingers, freezing even through her gloves. The wind screamed louder. She thought of all the stories she'd heard as a girl, people frozen, standing their eyes wide open like glass. That could be her now. But Tobias was solid in front of her, moving with the rhythm of someone who'd done this alone too many times. When they finished, they hurried back inside, stamping snow off their boots and peeling off layers. Annie's face burned from the cold, but her chest burned more from something like pride. She hadn't faltered. She hadn't run. "You all right?" he asked, pouring water from the kettle into 2 tin cups. She nodded. Felt like walking through a scream. "That's about right." They sat again in silence, the fire throwing shadows across the log walls. Annie stared into the flickering light. "Do you ever get scared?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately. His fingers traced the rim of the cup. "I used to be scared of forgetting her," he said. "Thought if I let a day go by without feeling that pain, I'd lose her completely. And now I'm more scared of staying stuck there forever." Annie exhaled slowly, her shoulders sinking. "I get that." They didn't talk again for a while, not until the wind softened and the cabin creaked less, like it wanted to fall apart. Then Tobias pulled down an old leather-bound journal from a shelf. Its edges were curled and the pages had yellowed like parchment. "This was Mira's," he said, offering it to Annie. She took it with both hands, surprised. "Are you sure she kept stories in it?" "Thoughts. I haven't read them all." Annie opened the first page. The handwriting was small and tidy, the ink faded in places. She read aloud softly. "Some days I think the wind talks more sense than people. It knows how to leave and come back without apology." She stopped, swallowed. She was smart. She was, Tobias said. She had a way of putting things that made them feel less heavy. Annie read another page, then another. The words weren't polished or fancy. They were raw, honest, sometimes funny, sometimes aching. She read until her voice cracked. "I wish I'd known her. She would have liked you," he said. Annie closed the journal gently. "I feel like I'm trespassing." "No," Tobias said. "You're helping remember." That night, while the wind slept and the world outside turned ghostly white, Tobias opened the cedar box beside his bed. Inside lay keepsakes, an old ribbon, a dried rose, a brooch missing its clasp. He added something new, a folded paper with Annie's writing on it, a line she'd scribbled after reading Mira's words. "Maybe the wind's not coming to take something, but to give us room to start over." The next morning broke clear and silent. The storm had passed, leaving the world blanketed and bright. Annie stepped out onto the porch, boots crunching lightly. Tobias stood beside her holding 2 cups of tea. "It's different now," she said, blinking into the pale sun. "What is the silence? Before it felt like punishment. Now it feels like space." He nodded. "That's how you know healing's begun." She turned to him, eyes searching. "What happens when it's done?" He looked out toward the barn, the trees, the snow-covered hills that seemed to stretch forever. "Then we decide who we want to be next." Annie didn't answer, but her lips curled into something close to a smile. "Maybe the wind's not coming to take something, but to give us room to start over." The sun filtered through the frost-laced windows, gold and pale, casting long shadows across the kitchen floor. Annie stood at the stove, stirring the pot of oats, slowly, her hands wrapped in dish towels. She still didn't like how her fingers shook in the mornings, but she liked the sound of the bubbling pot, the way it made the place feel lived in. Safe. Tobias came in from the barn, snow clinging to the folds of his coat. He smelled of hay and cold air and horses, and Annie had come to find that strangely comforting. "Goats are restless," he said, pulling off his gloves. "Spring's not far. They feel it." "Do people feel it too?" she asked, turning to him with a quiet half-smile. He didn't answer right away, just poured water into the tin basin and began washing his hands. His silence didn't feel like avoidance anymore. It felt like he was sifting for the truest words. "I think we do," he said finally. "Not all of us admit it, but we know." They sat at the rough-hewn table with steaming bowls between them. Annie ate slowly, letting the warmth travel all the way through. The blizzard had passed, and the valley had come out the other side white and new. That morning, everything felt lighter. "I was thinking of going into town," she said. Tobias raised an eyebrow. "That's so Mary Ellen said the post office keeps books out front on a shelf free for the taking. You got your eye on something?" She shrugged. "Anything with pages." He leaned back, nodding. "All right. I'll hitch up the wagon." "No," she said quickly. "I mean, I want to go alone." The words hung there. He studied her the way he always did, without rush, without judgment. Just quiet understanding. "You sure I need to? I need to walk through town like I belong there. Not hiding in the cabin. Not waiting for someone to rescue me." His jaw tightened, not out of anger, but out of something else. Worry, maybe. Or restraint. "Take the pistol," he said. "Keep it in your coat." She nodded. Later that morning, she stepped down the front porch steps, scarf tied tight, boots, laced hair tucked beneath her cap. Tobias stood by the post, watching. He didn't wave. He just tipped his head once, like a blessing. The walk into town was colder than she expected, even with the sun. Snow crunched like brittle bones beneath her feet, and her breath clouded in the air. But she kept going, hands deep in her coat pockets, back straight. People stared when she stepped into the general store. Not in the cruel way they used to back at the orphanage, mocking or curious, but in that slow way country folks size up anything new. She could feel their eyes follow her as she walked past barrels of flour and sacks of oats, but she didn't shrink. She asked the clerk about the bookshelf and found it tucked by the window near the post office. The books were old dog-eared, some with cracked spines and penciled notes in the margins. She picked up a worn copy of Jane Eyre and smiled. "Good choice," came a voice behind her. Annie turned and saw a girl about her age. Auburn hair, kind eyes, arms full of books. "You like Bronte?" the girl asked. "I've never read her. I just, like the name." The girl laughed softly. "Well, if you like stubborn girls with fire in them, you'll like that one." Annie looked at the spine again. "That sounds about right. I'm Rachel. I help catalog these for Miss Brewer." "Annie." Rachel stuck out her hand, and Annie shook it. Tell you what Rachel said. You take that one, and when you're done, come back and tell me what you think. I'll trade you for another. Deal, Annie said. It felt strange to say it, like participating in a world she wasn't used to. On her way back, she passed the church steps. She paused there, hand tightening around the book. The last time she stood there, she'd been someone else, cold, bruised, unwanted. She bent down, tracing a fingertip across the worn wood of the railing. Her breath caught. You made it through, she whispered to herself. You're not her anymore. When she returned, Tobias was chopping wood near the barn. He didn't look up when she walked up beside him, just split another log clean down the middle. Town still standing. She smiled. Mostly. He paused, leaning on the axe. You all right? She nodded. Someone called me by my name today. No one's done that in a long time without expecting something from me. He studied her for a long second. You get your book? She held it up. Good. Fire's waiting inside. That night, as snow began to fall again, soft and slow like feathers, Annie curled up near the stove book open on her knees. She read the first line 3 times, not because she didn't understand it, but because it felt like beginning something sacred. Tobias sat across from her, mending a torn strap with quiet hands. After a long silence, he spoke. I keep thinking about that day on the steps. She looked up. You had every reason to hate this world, but you didn't. You just wanted to be seen. Annie closed the book. Her throat ached. I still do, she said. He nodded slowly. Well, he said I see you now. She blinked fast, the words pressing against her like warm light. Then she whispered the thought that had been blooming quietly inside her ever since the storm passed. I think I was meant to be left behind so I could finally be found. The days warmed slowly, like a pot left to simmer on a back burner. Snow melted in rivulets along the edges of the barn, and the mud smelled rich and hopeful. Annie started each morning by opening the shutters and breathing in that mix of damp pine and sun-warmed earth. It was a quiet kind of renewal, one she could feel in her bones. She was halfway through Jane Eyre, underlining passages with a stub of pencil Tobias had left by the lamp. Some of the words made her stop completely. Words about strength, fire, loneliness, and the hunger to be more than what the world said you were. Tobias had started trusting her with chores beyond the kitchen. She learned how to shovel feed into troughs, mend fences, even carry buckets of water without sloshing half of it down her boots. She loved the ache in her shoulders at the end of the day. It was the kind of tired that felt earned. Rachel stopped by every Wednesday now, either dropping off books or just visiting with a fresh loaf from the bakery her aunt ran in town. They sat under the porch eaves, sipping coffee from tin mugs, talking about things that weren't painful. Town's asking about you, Rachel said one afternoon, nudging Annie's arm. In a good way. Annie smiled. That's a first. You've got them curious. They want to know what kind of girl shows up in a blizzard and makes a home with the rancher who never talks. Annie looked down at the mug in her hands. Sometimes I want to know that too. Rachel tilted her head. You ever ask him? I think he's carrying more than he says. Aren't we all? Rachel said. But you, Annie, you've changed. You're not the girl I saw on those church steps. I'm not sure who I am yet. That's the good part, Rachel whispered. You get to find out. That night after Rachel left, Annie stood out by the corral, watching the horses shift and breathe in the dim light. Tobias joined her, silently handing her a biscuit wrapped in cloth. Still don't eat enough, he said. I do now, she answered. I even sleep through the night. Most times. He nodded once. Good. She wanted to ask what he remembered from that day on the steps, why he had stopped, what made him look twice. But his silence held something sacred, and she didn't want to pry. Instead, she asked, "What brought you out to this place?" He stared off toward the ridge. "Something I needed to forget." Did it work? No. But the land doesn't ask questions. It just lets you keep moving. She nodded. That made sense. Some days she still carried the voice of that cruel matron at the orphanage in her chest, the way the children laughed when her name was scratched off the adoption list again. But lately those voices had started to fade. She spent the next day in the pasture helping patch a section of fencing the mule had leaned too hard against. Midway through, she spotted something fluttering in the wind, bright white against the dull ground. She walked toward it, boots sinking slightly in the thawing earth. A paper, torn from a ledger. Her name, Annie Whitlow. But it wasn't one of Tobias's feed invoices or her own scribbled lists. It was an orphanage record. Her stomach knotted. She followed the trail, more papers scattered, snagged in bushes, tucked in branches like forgotten birds' nests. Tobias's old trunk lay open near the shed, its contents half spilled by the wind. Her hand trembled as she lifted another sheet. There was a letter yellowed with age. To whom it may concern, this child has been marked unsuitable for domestic placement due to emotional instability and physical condition. Annie dropped it. Her vision swam. She backed away, heart pounding, barely noticing the slam of the cabin door until Tobias's voice reached her. "I didn't read all of it." She turned. "I found the file in the church vestibule that day," he said, walking slowly toward her. "They'd left it beside you, like you weren't even worth taking your name. You kept it." Her voice cracked. "I couldn't leave it. I didn't know what to do with it. So I kept it." She folded her arms tightly as if bracing herself against the wind. "Why would you keep a record of everything wrong with me? Because it wasn't true. Then why hold on to it?" He paused. His face had gone still like a pond before a storm. "I kept it to remind me what this world throws away." The silence between them was brittle. "You should have burned it," she said, barely above a whisper. "I know. I should have done a lot of things." They stood there in the field, the cold wind threading through the dry grass, the past between them like a rift. Then she whispered, "You kept my name." He looked up. "You didn't change it. You didn't call me girl or child or make up something easier to forget. You used it, like it meant something." "It does," he said. "You do." Her throat thickened, but she wouldn't cry. "Not here, not now." He took a slow step forward. "I never meant to hurt you by keeping those papers. I didn't know if one day you'd want to see the whole story." She nodded slowly. "Maybe not today, but someday." They gathered the papers in silence, stuffing them back into the trunk. Later that night, he lit the fire and without saying a word handed her the folder. She looked at it for a long time. Then one by one she fed the pages to the flame. As they burned, curling and blackening and rising in smoke, she felt something lift. Not entirely, but enough to breathe deeper. He stood behind her, silent, unmoving, and in the hush of that moment she whispered, "Just because the world called me broken doesn't mean I have to stay that way." The frost had receded into memory by the time the first wagon rolled into town bearing the spring fair banners. Annie and Tobias stood near the pasture fence watching the flicker of color against the ridgeline like a far-off promise. A few horses stirred their ears, twitching. The scent of turned soil and new grass clung to the wind, heavy with possibility. Tobias leaned against the post arms, crossed. "You should go." Annie tightened the scarf at her neck, unsure whether the sudden wind or his words gave her more pause. To the fair, he nodded. "Rachel will be there. Town's starting to notice you. Time to see what that means." Annie swallowed hard. Her fingers curled around the fence rail. And you, I've had my fill of crowds. But I'll be here when you get back. The simple certainty in his voice settled something inside her. Like a thread pulling taut between them, quiet and invisible but unbroken. The morning of the fair, Rachel arrived with her hair pinned up in fresh curls and a borrowed dress for Annie, a simple cotton blue with buttons that caught the sunlight. "I thought you might want to feel like yourself again," Rachel said, offering the dress like a peace offering. Annie ran her fingers along the hem. "I'm still figuring out who that is." "Well," Rachel smiled, "you'll look lovely while doing it." They rode into town on the bakery wagon, sugar dust rising from the crates of sweetbreads stacked in back. Main Street had been dressed up for the occasion, bunting strung from storefront to lamppost, laughter echoing from the general store porch. Children ran barefoot, chasing each other with tin pails. Annie held back at first, standing behind a barrel of pickles and watching. She didn't want to be seen too closely. But then she caught sight of a little girl near the pie stand, no older than 6, standing on tiptoes to peek at the lemon meringue. Her mother gently brushed a loose curl from the child's face and whispered something that made the girl giggle. An ache stirred in Annie's chest. She turned and ran straight into Mrs. Harland. "Oh, my Annie Whitlow." Annie froze. Mrs. Harland was the mayor's wife. She ran every church raffle, every bake sale, every committee with an iron smile. "I nearly didn't recognize you, dear." Mrs. Harland continued, stepping back to look her over. "You've changed since last winter." Annie didn't know what to say. The townspeople had always looked past her until they didn't, until she was a warning or a burden. Never simply a girl. Rachel stepped forward. "She's been working hard out at Tobias's ranch, keeping him fed, keeping the fences standing." "I heard that," Mrs. Harland said. "Some say it's the best that man's looked in years." Annie kept her hands folded tight. "I'm learning." "Well," Mrs. Harland said, softening slightly. "You look well. You've found a place, it seems." Annie forced a smile, nodding, and moved on before the conversation could dig deeper roots. They wandered the stalls, Annie's eyes catching on hand-stitched quilts, glazed pottery cinnamon pies, cooling on windowsills. For the first time in a long while, people weren't looking through her. They were meeting her eyes, smiling. Some even said her name. She bought a small corn-husk doll from a little boy with 2 missing teeth and tucked it into her coat pocket. Something about its crooked smile made her feel oddly braver. Later, while Rachel played fiddle near the gazebo, Annie walked toward the edge of the fairgrounds. The sun was falling low, smearing gold across the distant ridge. She closed her eyes and tried to hear what the wind was telling her. A voice startled her. "Well, I'll be. Annie Whitlow." She turned slowly. Matthew Crow. He hadn't grown much taller, but he still held his shoulders like a boy, trying to look more important than he was. His hair was neater, his jacket pressed, and his voice slick with that same old tone. "I heard you were still around," he said. "Working for the rancher. What's his name? Tobias something." She kept her voice even. "Tobias Reddick." "Well, you landed on your feet, didn't you, after everything? Didn't have much choice." Matthew stepped closer. "You know, you look different." "I am." He smirked. "Still got that edge to you." She took a step back. "Why are you here just saying hello?" Maybe curious how the town's cast-off girl became the fair's darling. She held his gaze. Maybe she stopped caring what the town thought. His smile faltered. "People don't forget things like they don't have to," she said, quiet steel in her voice. "I didn't change to make them forget. I changed because I deserved better than being treated like nothing." Matthew's lips twitched, Guess I should have kept my eye on you. You never saw me, Matthew. That was the problem. He chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. Well, you're full of fire now, huh? No, she said, stepping around him. I was always full of fire. You just never stood close enough to feel it. She walked away, heart pounding, and didn't look back. Rachel found her near the wagon as the sun dipped below the horizon. Ready to head home, Rachel asked, eyeing her closely. Annie nodded, smiling faintly. I said goodbye to something tonight. Or maybe someone. They rode in silence, the road humming under the wheels. That night, back at the ranch, Annie stepped inside to find Tobias setting down a fresh pot of stew. He glanced up, then paused, studying her face. Well, she smiled, tucking the cornhusk doll beside the lantern. It was good, she said. I saw who I used to be. He nodded once, and I didn't want to be her anymore. She moved to the stove, picking up a ladle, and added softly, I've spent my life trying not to take up space. But maybe I was never meant to stay small. The wind shifted sometime after midnight, dragging smoke across the hills from the east. Tobias had been up early walking the north pasture when he first smelled it. Not fire from the chimney or someone's camp cookpot, this was sharper, thicker. He paused near the ravine fence, nostrils, flaring eyes narrowing against the sunrise. A storm wasn't coming, but something sure was. By the time he got back to the barn, the haze had begun to settle, a faint smear across the sky. He found Annie brushing down the mule with firm, even strokes, a bandana tied over her mouth from habit, now more than fashion. You smell it, he asked. Annie nodded once her eyes meeting his. Been building since sunup. Doesn't feel right. He led her out past the garden and pointed toward the eastern ridge. That's not a cooking fire. No, she said. That's something big. Later that morning, word rode in on a lathered pony and a grim-faced courier. Smoke from a lumber camp out east. A sudden dry wind had taken it across a homestead line. No injuries yet, but fences had gone up in flame and some livestock was lost. Folks were rattled. There wasn't enough manpower to keep up with the spreading embers. Tobias stood by the porch post, reading the note again, jaw set. If the wind shifts west, we're next. Annie stepped up beside him. What do you need me to do? He looked at her. Really looked. You sure I've got 2 good arms and a strong back? I'm not about to stand around. He gave a short nod. We'll ride to the old stream bed. If fire jumps the ravine, that's where it'll try to come through. We set up a break there. You know how to swing a hatchet. She tightened the bandana at her neck. You'll have to catch me first. They loaded supplies, soaked burlap sacks, filled canteens, and packed saddlebags with cold biscuits and salted meat. Rachel arrived mid-morning, her cheeks flushed and eyes wide. I heard the riders. The church bell's been ringing since 9, she said breathlessly. Every man's been called. Every able one, anyway. I'm going, Annie said, slinging her pack. Rachel's mouth opened, then shut. You're serious. Annie met her gaze. We can't keep pretending I'm someone else. I live here now. I work here. That means when trouble comes, I stand with it. Rachel stared for a beat, then smiled, slow and sad. I just didn't expect you to become the kind of woman other women talk about. They set off before noon. The ride was long and thick with tension. The sky grew dim with soot, the smell acrid in their throats. Tobias led the way with his shoulders braced, not speaking unless needed. Annie rode close behind, one hand on her saddle horn, her mind scanning every sound in the brush. She wasn't afraid, not exactly, but something inside her had gone still, an old part that used to cower, now sat upright, alert. At the stream bed, they dismounted and got to work. The trees were sparse here, but the underbrush was dry and hungry. Tobias felled branches, his axe sharp and sure. Annie dragged the limbs to the pile and soaked burlap, laying it in a line like a damp guardrail. Smoke thickened with every passing hour. It clung to their clothes, their skin, their hair. By mid-afternoon, her arms trembled with fatigue. You holding up, Tobias called over the din of snapping brush. Annie wiped sweat from her brow. Barely, but I'm still swinging. He grinned at that, a brief flash of pride. Sometime near dusk, a gust hit hard from the east. They felt it before they saw it. An eerie stillness, then a roar. The fire had jumped again. Tobias barked orders. Circle the north bend. If it reaches the grass line, we lose the fence. They moved fast, instincts overriding exhaustion. Annie sprinted to the saddlebag, grabbing another soaked sheet, coughing against the ash in her lungs. And that's when she saw them. Two boys, no older than 10, on the far ridge, caught between two tongues of flame. They were frozen backs against a rock, eyes wild with terror. "Tobias," she screamed. He followed her gaze, then cursed. "They're the Jenkins boys. Their pa must have left them behind." Without another word, Annie was running. Tobias shouted, "Annie, wait," but she didn't. The fire was closer now, heat pressing in like a wall. Annie ducked low, heart thudding, legs pumping. She didn't think. She just moved. Smoke stung her eyes, turned the world to gray, but the boys' cries cut through. She reached them just as the wind changed again, pushing the smoke upward for one blessed second. Enough to see. "Come on," she said, gripping the older one's wrist. "We're going now." But he stammered. "No time. Run with me." They bolted, stumbling through brittle grass and charred stumps. Annie wrapped the wet burlap around them like a cloak. A branch fell behind them, flaming and cracking. The younger boy tripped, and she hoisted him onto her hip, teeth gritted against the weight. Her legs screamed. Her lungs burned. But she didn't stop. At the last clearing, Tobias appeared through the haze, running toward them. He took the boy from her arms and grabbed the other's hand. They made it to the ridge. They made it through. They collapsed near the water trough, coughing, wheezing, hands trembling. Tobias looked at her through tear-streaked soot. You could have died. So could they. He didn't speak for a long time, just stared at her like he'd never seen her before. Then softly he said, "I thought you were strong, Annie. But today, you were the fire." She looked down at her hands, blackened, blistered, shaking, and felt something rise inside her that she couldn't name. When the boy's father arrived later, falling to his knees with gratitude, Annie quietly slipped away to the barn. She sat on the floor, back against the wall, letting the cool night air wrap around her. She didn't cry. She just breathed. And in that breath was something sacred, something unshakable. She was no longer the girl who survived. She was the woman who ran into the fire and came out whole. The rain came 2 days after the fire, soft and steady like an apology. It fell on scorched earth, smoldering tree roots, and blackened pasture fences. It fell on the Jenkins boys' roof, still standing by some mercy. And it fell on Annie's raw, blistered hands as she stood on the porch, watching the world begin to cool. Tobias had wanted her to rest. Even Rachel had insisted, but Annie couldn't stay in bed. Not when everything outside still smelled like smoke and quiet gratitude. She kept her movements slow, her shoulders stiff from overwork and heat. But she moved. She needed to. Each drop of rain felt like permission to breathe again. Tobias emerged from the barn, hat pulled low against the drizzle. He carried a wrapped bundle in his arms and wordlessly stepped up onto the porch beside her. "Early delivery came," he said, handing it over. She took it gently. Inside the oilcloth was a new pair of gloves, soft buckskin lined at the cuffs. Real ranch gloves. Not stitched from scraps or second-hand leather. These had been chosen, measured, bought for her. Her throat tightened. "Thank you." He nodded. "They'll help when you're back on fence duty. Once you're ready. I'll be ready by morning." He gave her a look that wasn't scolding, wasn't soft either. "You don't have to prove anything, Annie." She turned toward the edge of the porch, eyes tracing the ridge where the fire had first jumped. "Maybe not to you." His voice dropped. Then who she didn't answer. Not because she couldn't, but because he already knew. He saw it in her silence. The girl who'd once been slapped into silence was now a woman building her own voice from the ashes. Later that day, Rachel arrived with a covered basket hair damp beneath her shawl. She moved into the kitchen like she always had a place there, setting the basket on the table. "Venison stew. You'll both eat every spoonful or I'll start crying and make a scene." Annie smiled, pulling out bowls. "I'd rather fight another fire than see that." Rachel didn't sit right away. She opened her bag and pulled out something wrapped in brown parchment. "This came in with the mail carrier this morning. Addressed to you." Annie froze. Her name written in her mother's handwriting sat inked across the front. Tobias walked in behind her, saw the change in her posture, and waited quietly by the door. Annie stared at the letter a moment longer, then reached for it with steady fingers. She opened it with no ceremony, no dread. Just resolve. She read the words in silence, her face unreadable. When she looked up, her voice was flat. She heard about the fire. Says she hopes I'm not dead because it would be such a shame after all she did to raise me right. Rachel scoffed under her breath. "Right." Annie kept reading. "She says I ought to remember that no matter how far I run, I'll always carry her blood in my veins. That I owe her." Tobias stepped closer. "You don't owe her a damn thing." Annie folded the letter slowly. "She also says she's coming. Next week." The room went still. Rachel blinked. "Here she's coming here." She said she wants to see for herself the mountain man who ruined her daughter. Annie met Tobias's gaze. "She means you." His jaw flexed, but his voice stayed calm. "Let her come. You don't belong to her anymore." Annie gave a small, bitter smile. "She's not coming to claim me. She's coming to break me again." "She won't," he said simply. Rachel reached across the table, laying a hand on Annie's wrist. "What do you want to do?" Annie thought about it long and hard. She thought about the years of walking on eggshells, about being shoved into corners, called names that bruised more than fists ever could. She thought about the fire, about the way her arms had ached as she carried those boys, about how Tobias had looked at her like she was made of more than bone and scar. "I want her to see who I am now," Annie said. "Not for her. For me." The day her mother arrived was cloudless. The earth still smelled of rain, and the fences had just begun to be rebuilt. Annie waited out front, gloves in her pocket, hair tied back. Not dressed up, not hiding either. The wagon stopped, and her mother stepped down. She hadn't changed much, maybe smaller somehow. Less towering than the version Annie had held in her memory. But her mouth was still thin with disapproval, and her eyes scanned the property like it was too humble to be real. "You live here," she said. Like an animal, Annie didn't flinch. "It's home." Her mother's gaze moved over the barn, the porch, the distant ridge. "So this is what you traded your family for? Smoke and dirt?" "I didn't trade anything," Annie replied. "I walked away. You just never noticed." The older woman snorted. "You think because you chased after some mountain man you're suddenly better than where you came from." Tobias stepped out, then calm as a stone. "I didn't chase him," Annie said. He didn't ask for anything. He just saw me. Her mother looked at Tobias, then back at Annie, venom gathering behind her teeth. You always were ungrateful. I clothed you, fed you, kept a roof, you hit me. Annie said quietly, every time you were angry. Every time I looked too much like someone you hated. You didn't raise me. You tried to erase me. There was no screaming, no slamming of doors, just silence. Dense and final. Her mother's face went pale. You don't talk to me that way. I do now, Annie said, because I'm not afraid of you anymore. Tobias stepped forward, then not to threaten, not to tower, but to stand beside her. This land may not be fancy, he said, but it's honest, and Annie's earned every bit of her place in it. Her mother turned, face pinched, and climbed back onto the wagon without another word. They watched it roll away, dust rising behind the wheels. Annie didn't cry. She just stood still, wind in her hair, eyes fixed on the horizon. Tobias turned to her. You okay? She nodded. For the first time. Yeah. And then she added quieter but with certainty, today I wasn't the scared girl she raised. I was the woman she never thought I'd become. He didn't answer, just reached for her hand and held it, dirt and all. The sun dipped lower, casting gold over the fields. She didn't feel small anymore. She felt whole. The town hadn't changed, not in the ways Annie thought it might. The wooden boardwalks still creaked under boots. The mercantile still smelled of molasses and dust. The bell above the door still rang too sharp, like a slap. But people changed. And when Annie walked through that town with her chin lifted and Tobias at her side, it wasn't the buildings that whispered, it was the people. Some turned away out of guilt. Some nodded like they finally understood. A few still stared with that same judgment they'd always reserved for women who didn't stay quiet. But Annie didn't flinch. They passed the barber, the bank, the churchyard gate. Children ran by, oblivious to the history soaked into every wood beam of the town's heart. Rachel was waiting near the hitching post by the post office. She carried a satchel and wore a pale yellow dress that looked like springtime itself had stitched it. You sure you want to go in there? She asked, glancing toward the saloon across the street. Annie nodded. I need to. Not for revenge, just for clarity. Tobias squeezed her hand. We're not here to settle scores, but I won't let you go in alone. They crossed the street together, boots on dirt and gravel. The swinging doors of the saloon groaned as they stepped inside. The air smelled of old whiskey and tobacco. A piano stood silent in the corner. The few midday patrons paused, heads turning, and behind the bar, polishing a glass with a ragged towel, stood the man Annie hadn't seen in years, her father. He looked older, his hair grayer, thinner. The weight of too many lost years sagged in his shoulders, but his eyes were the same cold, narrow, calculating. He recognized her immediately. Annie. She nodded. Hello, Pa. He set down the glass, stepped forward slightly. Didn't expect to see you again. I wouldn't have come, she said, voice even, but I heard you sent for me. He shifted his weight. Just thought, after the fire you might need something. You always were stubborn, but you weren't made for that kind of work. I didn't come to ask for anything, Annie said. I came because you used to call me soft. Said I wouldn't last a season on my own. Tobias stayed by her side, silent but steady. I remember her father said, tone flat. I wanted you to see me now. Not for your approval, but because I stopped needing it. He looked at Tobias, then at her again. So this is the man who taught me I wasn't broken. The saloon went quiet. Even the poker game in the corner paused. Her father's expression flickered. Your mother wrote me. Said you were letting that man turn you against your family. She turned me against you long before I met Tobias. He reached for a bottle behind the bar, poured a shot, but didn't drink it. You were always willful, he muttered. Could have made something of yourself if you'd just listened. I did make something, Annie said. A life. A home. People who don't raise their hands when things don't go their way. He chuckled bitterly. You think you've got it all figured out? This man beside you, what's he got that I didn't? He listens, Annie said. He stays when things get hard. He doesn't call love a favor owed. Her father said nothing, just picked up the shot glass and tossed it back. Rachel stepped forward. We're done here, Annie. But Annie shook her head just once. I'm not here to fight, she said. I just needed to say something to the man who tried to convince me I was nothing. He looked up, eyes tired. And what's that? She stepped closer. Her voice was low, firm. You didn't break me. You lit the fire that forged me. His hand paused mid-pour. Then she turned, not waiting for a response. The three of them walked back into the sunlight boots, finding firm earth. Annie didn't look back once. Outside, the wind shifted. Dust curled around their feet as if trying to carry the weight of old memories away with it. They stopped at the general store next. Annie handed over a folded list, stocked up on nails, flour lye soap, and a bit of candy for the Jenkins boys. Tobias helped load the sacks into the wagon. Inside the store, the owner's wife, Mrs. Grayson, pulled Annie aside gently. You're braver than most, she whispered, not meeting her eyes. I was there the day your mother slapped you outside the church steps. Folks saw. We didn't know what to do. You do now, Annie said. Not with malice. Just finality. Mrs. Grayson nodded, swallowing shame. We should have stepped in. You can now, Annie said, if someone else needs it. By the time they climbed into the wagon and started back down the trail toward the ranch, the sky had cleared again. The air was still cool, the kind of crisp that hinted spring would soon follow. Annie leaned her head against Tobias's shoulder as the wheels jostled over familiar rocks. I feel lighter, she murmured. You should, he said. You laid down a load no one should have had to carry this long. She looked at the hills, now green again after the rain. It doesn't fix everything. No, he agreed, but it lets you build new things in the space where the old weight used to be. She closed her eyes and listened to the creak of leather, the steady plod of hooves. The road home was still rough, but for the first time it didn't scare her. Rain had returned by the time they reached the ranch. Not the angry kind, but soft and steady, the kind that cleaned the dust from windows and made the earth smell like life again. The porch was slick with it. The boards darkened the rocking chair, still gently swaying where Tobias had left it earlier that morning. Inside, the fire had kept burning. Rachel stirred the pot on the stove, glancing over her shoulder as Annie stepped in and unwrapped her scarf. How was it, Rachel asked, though her voice was cautious, as if she already knew the answer. I said what I needed to say, Annie replied, and then I walked out. Rachel nodded. That's more than most ever get. Annie smiled faintly. Her boots left damp marks on the floor as she crossed to the kettle. Tobias was in the barn unloading feed. The air inside the house was warm, laced with wood smoke and rosemary. Later that evening, the rain softened to a whisper against the tin roof. Annie sat curled on the settee, fingers mending the hem of a pillowcase she hadn't touched in months. Rachel hummed by the hearth, mending a coat, and when Tobias returned, soaked through from hitching down the horses, he peeled off his coat, kissed Annie's temple, and sat beside her without a word. They didn't need many words these days. Rachel broke the silence. I had a letter. Annie looked up. From who, my brother Matthew? Said they're passing through next week headed west. He asked if we'd meet him in Wichita Falls. Annie blinked. You haven't seen him since the trial. Rachel nodded. He stood by my father that whole time. Said I'd embarrassed the family. But now he's asking to talk. Tobias leaned forward, elbows on his knees. You want to go? Rachel hesitated, then gave a soft sigh. I don't know, but I think I need to. Annie looked at her, and the air between them stretched like fabric pulled taut. You should, Annie said at last, even if it just confirms that you've outgrown him. Rachel smiled weakly. Like you did with yours. Annie set down her stitching. That's not why I went. I didn't go to prove I was better than him. I went to remember that I was never what he said I was. Rachel stared into the fire. You think people really change? Tobias answered before Annie could. Some don't. But sometimes it's not about whether they change. It's about whether you're still chained to who they used to be. Rachel swallowed hard and nodded. That night, after Rachel had gone to bed and the fire burned low, Tobias pulled a chair near the window and sat in the quiet. Annie joined him a moment later, her shawl wrapped tight. The moonlight spilled over the fields. Rain had stopped entirely. The fence line gleamed. I saw her, Annie said quietly. Tobias turned his head. My mother, just before we left town. She didn't say anything, just watched from behind the curtain of the old tailor's building. Same sharp eyes, same look of disapproval. Tobias reached over, took her hand. She never wanted me to leave, Annie whispered. Even when she beat me, it was like she wanted to shape me into something she could live with. I think that was her way of holding on. He didn't speak. He just listened. Annie's voice trembled slightly, and part of me still wanted her to say something. Even after everything. I think there's still a girl inside me who wants her mama to choose her. Tobias turned his voice steady and low. That girl inside you, she's not weak. She's brave enough to hope even when she shouldn't have to. Annie nodded slowly, blinking back the weight in her chest. He kissed the back of her hand. But I'm proud of the woman you've become. And I'm not going anywhere. Her voice cracked as she whispered, I'm not the same girl who begged to be loved. I've learned to love myself enough to walk away. Silence settled soft and deep, the kind that wraps around you like a quilt. They sat there for a long time watching the fields under the moon. The next morning, the smell of coffee and cornbread greeted the dawn. Rachel had already saddled up the horse, her bags packed with modest care. She adjusted her bonnet in the mirror and took one last look at the house before stepping out. Annie followed her to the yard. Sure you don't want one of us to come? Rachel smiled. Number 1. I think I need to face this one alone. She mounted up, reins in hand, and paused. If he doesn't show, she said, or if he says the wrong thing, you still win. Annie finished for her. Rachel grinned, turned her horse, and rode off down the path, the rising sun slicing through the trees. Annie stood there a long time watching the road. Tobias joined her, a mug of coffee in each hand. He handed her one, sipped from the other. She'll be all right, he said. I know, Annie said. But I also know how hard it is to walk toward something you're not sure you want to see. She looked toward the barn, where the roof still bore a dark mark from the old lightning strike. It hadn't fallen. It had held. They'd rebuilt, renailed, retrusted the structure. Not because it was easy, but because it was worth keeping. And she felt that in her own bones. The wind picked up, brushing strands of hair across her face. She closed her eyes and let it move through her. Later, she returned to the house. There were apples to peel, linens to air, letters to write. Life didn't wait for healing, it unfolded around it. But there was peace now, a steadiness in her chest that hadn't been there before. She moved through the kitchen, her fingers brushing across the wooden table. The same table where she'd once sat shaking, afraid of the girl in the mirror, afraid of being seen. Now she was seen, and still standing. She picked up the pen, opened her journal, and wrote the date at the top. And just beneath it, in her small, clear hand, they tried to shape me through pain. But I found my shape in love, and she meant every word. The educational lesson learned from this story is that no matter how late in life healing begins, it is never wasted time. People may carry the weight of old wounds for decades, but dignity, self-respect, and peace can still be rebuilt through steady work, honest relationships, and the courage to walk away from harm. The story reminds us that we are not required to keep suffering just because it is familiar, and that choosing kindness, especially toward ourselves, can quietly change everything. In the end, a good life is not about proving others wrong, but about finally living right within our own skin.